and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Fiona here with this week's podcast, which is a presentation given by Dr. Philippa Whitford on her time spent working in Gaza. The event was hosted by Christians for Independence. Philippa did give a slideshow, which obviously we can't reproduce on an audio podcast, but if you'd like to see the version with the slides, it is up on our YouTube channel and the link will be in the notes below. Even without the slides, it's well worth listening to.
I was really sorry that I didn't manage to get through to help, actually partly to help you out with the recording, but to listen to the talk. It's really worthwhile listening to. Dr. Whitford's been out there since I think the early 1990s was when she first went out as a medical volunteer, and she got elected to Westminster 2015 general election. By 2016, in the Easter parliamentary recess, she was back in Gaza again, helping out, training people, doing operations. So she's, got a long-standing and heartfelt connection with the Palestinians, and it must be heartbreaking for her. I mean, and her husband. These hospitals are now piles of rubble.
Yeah, very, very moving presentation, as you'll see.
Thanks very much to Christians for Independence for the invitation. Obviously, because of what we're all witnessing in Gaza at the moment, there's a lot of interest, and therefore I'm really delighted for the opportunity to come and talk to you about my connection to Gaza and my experience there. Now, as Christians for Independence, there may be some of you who have had the incredible opportunity to visit Israel and Palestine or the Holy Land, but it's anything but holy. Although it is the most important site for Judaism and Christianity, and one of the most important sites for Islam, and should therefore be a place where the three peoples of the book come together, it has seen nothing but division and violence. I can't believe there's anyone in this room who, like myself, was shocked on the 7th of October when we heard about the horrific Hamas attack, and particularly as the details of that started to emerge. And while many of us here may be supporters of Palestinian rights and sovereignty, we need to recognise the pain of the bereaved of Israel is no less than the pain of a bereaved mother in Gaza. The fear of families of hostages wondering if their loved ones are alive is no less than a family in Gaza wondering if their missing daughter or son or husband is alive somewhere and displaced or trapped under rubble. Israel, of course, like any country, has the right to defend itself. But what we have watched over the last 8 months, I don't think there's anyone who can defend that as self-defence. And that's the issue. And the UK government, and indeed the Labour Party, who tried to defend what we have been watching over the last 8 months, defending the indefensible, are actually undermining international law and international humanitarian law itself. With previous genocides, whether you're talking about Srebrenica, Rwanda, Cambodia, or even the original Nazi Holocaust, we didn't know the true horror until afterwards. We're watching this hour by hour and day by day on our phones. There won't be anybody who can claim that they didn't know. And I think it's important to realise that Palestinian history didn't start on the 7th of October. It goes back over a century to the Balfour Declaration, when the UK Foreign Minister promised the same land to two peoples. That declaration includes granting a homeland for the Jewish people, but it also says the non-Jewish inhabitants must be protected. And unfortunately, one part of that declaration came to fruition, and the other half has never been recognised. We have the Nakba in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were driven off their lands. Occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza since 1967, along with East Jerusalem. And also Gaza has been subjected to a strict blockade over the last 17 years. And this map, which I hope you can see, you see how tiny Gaza is. It's 25 miles by 5 miles. Now, when I'm writing to, or was writing to local constituents, I would describe it as our Drossen to Ayr. There'll be something in your area that you can see on a map that is that size, and then you picture 2.3 million people squashed into it. It's incredibly overcrowded. And the majority of the West Bank isn't under Palestinian control, even though this was described as being a future Palestinian state. It is reduced to having tiny, you could describe them as Bantustans, all separated from each other, with the vast majority of the West Bank under direct Israeli control. And what we have watched over years and years and years, but accelerating in the last decade, and even happening now while the international community has its eyes focused on Gaza, is what I call conquest by concrete. Every time I would go back, I would see the expansion of old settlements, or I would see new settlements, always on the tops of the hills in the West Bank, and just spread out slowly over the land. And this relentless settlement building amounts to annexation. And even Netanyahu, at one point just a couple of years ago, claimed he was going to directly annex the West Bank. And while we're focused on Gaza, what we're not hearing so much about is settlers who are driving Palestinians out of their villages, off their farms, and trying to drive them out of the West Bank. So while this talk will focus on Gaza, the West Bank is critical to any future Palestinian state. And the two-state solution that international leaders are so fond of talking about and saying, oh, we support this, is gradually disappearing in front of our eyes. And how can you say, as a UK government, we support a two-state solution, and yet you don't recognise two states? How does that make sense? Now, our connection with Gaza goes back to 1991, when my husband Hans, who's in the audience, and I went as medical volunteers with MacLeod for Palestinians. This was just after the First Gulf War in 1991. At that time, the Palestinians were utterly under direct occupation within Gaza. They were put under curfew from 8 o'clock at night. They couldn't go out. There were often long curfews of 2 or 3 days, and they wouldn't even allow ambulances to move during that time. The crossings were completely controlled, so that sometimes if we were trying to send a patient to Jerusalem for specialist treatment, we wouldn't get them out. And it was completely illegal to fly the Palestinian flag. A group put this up in the middle of the night, just before Eid al-Fitr at the end of Ramadan. And that's the only time in our almost year and a half we ever saw a Palestinian flag flying in Gaza. But what Gaza didn't have was hunger and famine. Gaza was actually quite lush, it was quite fertile, and was able to produce crops, fruit, vegetables, etc. on its own. And this is just a picture of Hans in our local fruit shop to give you an idea of that. The contrast with what we see at the moment, when it isn't just buildings. A lot of the imagery you see from Gaza is the destroyed buildings of Gaza City, of the refugee camps. But also the olive groves, the farms are all being bombed. The agricultural land is deliberately being bombed and destroyed. And we both worked in Ahli hospital, which you may remember was hit by a missile on the 17th of October last year. This was an UNRWA-funded hospital at that time, and we provided all the inpatient care for the 1948 refugees and their descendants. At that time, the population of Gaza was about 1 million, and about half of them were under UNRWA care. And they would get free inpatient treatment within Al-Ahli Hospital. And my job was to develop surgical services, particularly introducing a urology service, while a Palestinian surgeon was getting training in London, and to provide training to local surgeons and education, particularly for young doctors. Just of interest, when I said to the registrar assessment panel in the west of Scotland that I was going to leave and go to Gaza, I was told I would never work in the west of Scotland again. Well, funnily enough, that didn't quite work out for them. On the night that Al-Ahli was hit, I was meant to be doing a live webinar for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And it was only when I went in and joined the panel that I heard what had happened to the hospital. And I have to say, it was one of the hardest hours I've ever had to get through, because the live webinar had to continue when we had no idea of the casualty numbers. I had no idea whether friends and colleagues were alive or not. This was also during the first Intifada, which is described as the Intifada of the stone. Young protesters would throw stones at Israeli soldiers, and the soldiers would respond by shooting them, with a range of ammunition, which you see down at the bottom right. And that ranged from the far right heavy rubber baton rounds to, on the left, high velocity rifle ammunition. And when these high velocity bullets hit the body, they make a hell of a mess. And this is a young lad here in a wheelchair who'd been shot through his femoral artery in his thigh and would have lost his leg, but I was able to repair that by replacing it with a vein out of his leg. And he managed to keep his leg. When people came just hit with flesh wounds, simple flesh wounds, we would actually deal with them and they would go home. Because the IDF knew that if anyone was shot, it was them that had done the shooting. And they would raid the hospital on a regular basis and actually arrest anybody with gunshot wounds. So we always had to hide people in the hospital if we knew a raid was coming. So one of the other issues was, as well as these young adult men who would be protesting, there would often be boys in among them of 10, 11, 12. And of course, while the Israeli policy was to shoot in the legs, unfortunately, that's not the height for a child. So we would get young children in who had chest or abdominal injuries, including with high velocity ammunition. Now that could often be quite complex, but it's nothing in comparison to what colleagues in Gaza are dealing with now. We were not dealing with bombs, we were not dealing with missiles, we were not dealing with crush industry injuries from people being trapped or crushed under falling buildings. There's just no comparison between what Hans and I were dealing with and what they're dealing with now. In 2015, as has already been said, I was elected as an MP. Can't say it was ever a life plan, but you know, as they say, life happens when you've got 11 years. And I spoke in a debate in 2015, which was marking the anniversary of the invasion of Gaza in 2014. And some of the staff from Medical Aid for Palestinians were in the gallery and approached me. And I got the opportunity the following year to return to Gaza and to return to visit friends and colleagues here, as you see, in Ahli hospital. And by then, I no longer did general surgery after 20 years or trauma. I was purely specialised in breast cancer. And I had tried to make the case to MAP, even when we lived there, that there was more of an issue with breast cancer than they were aware of. Young Gazan doctors used to say to me, oh, our women marry very young and they have lots of children, all of which is protected against getting breast cancer. But when word got out that there was a woman surgeon in Gaza, the women just came out of the woodwork. So I always knew there was a bigger problem than was recognised. And so MAP let me approach this as a breast cancer service scoping visit. This is a group of women in a support group in Barej refugee camp, but not just this group. Every woman that I met who was a patient during that visit had had a mastectomy. She'd had her breast removed. They'd had what's called an axillary clearance, which means all of the lymph glands and a lot of tissue removed from under their arm, in the armpit. And that leaves so much scar tissue, it causes a complication called lymphedema, which is a big, heavy, swollen arm. And of course, they didn't have the support services my patients had here. They didn't have physiotherapy. They didn't even have ordinary prosthetics to put inside their bra to be a breast shape. So when I went out with Rohan Talbot from MAP, we had a whole suitcase which included 40 breast prostheses. So you can imagine when we landed in Ben Gurion Airport, Rohan dropped the suitcase and said, that's over to you. Now, how he thought that just because I was a woman, I could explain to the Israeli airport authorities why I just happened to bring 40 breast prostheses with me, I've never understood. But anyway, thankfully they didn't open the suitcase and they didn't have to explain. Indeed, when we met these women and they went into another room, it was like a Tupperware party, as they were obviously trying them all for size. And you couldn't believe what they had made their own prostheses out of, literally ranging from socks to bags of birdseed, trying to have some shape and some dignity. And they were so delighted just to have that very simple thing that would give them some degree of self-confidence and dignity. But one of the key issues in Gaza is there's no access to radiotherapy. Now, this isn't just important for breast cancer. Radiotherapy is a key treatment in many types of cancer. The thing on the left that looks like it's out of the film Alien is a radiotherapy machine. Some group had donated it, but it was old. It was already out of date and it was missing parts. So this was put into Al-Shifa Hospital at significant expense, but it never worked. No matter how many attempts at getting engineers to repair it, it never worked. And this is an example of a thing that Hans and I always call donation by force. We will give you instead of what you need. And that would be my recommendation for anybody involved in any kind of aid or development work. Work in partnership. What do you need? On top of old rubbish that was sometimes being sent out, the store at Ahli hospital had hundreds of thousands of dollars of brand new equipment, often donated from field hospitals after the Gulf War, that nobody local knew how to use. I was sometimes handling equipment that we didn't even have on the NHS, and yet it was just lying in boxes. So we used to go on forays into the storeroom and see what equipment we could liberate and put to good use. So I would say it's critical always to work in partnership with anyone that you're trying to help. And the blockade that I mentioned, it's been going on for the last 17 years, had an impact on our ability to get patients out to go to Jerusalem. This linear accelerator that you see on the right is in Augusta Victoria Hospital in East Jerusalem. And that is the only radiotherapy unit serving Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But patients have to get there. Now, from Gaza, the World Health Organization records the figures every month, but it's normally about 35 to 40% of patients who apply for a permit to leave, because people are not allowed to leave Gaza because of the blockade, either won't be given permission or will be directly refused. Sometimes they just don't hear. It's not even that easy for women in the West Bank. As I described, the West Bank is divided into all of these little bits and pieces of Palestinian territory separated by Area C, which is Israeli territory, with multiple checkpoints. So for patients from MAP's breast cancer unit in Nablus in the north, it's also a really difficult and arduous journey to go to East Jerusalem to get radiotherapy. And the blockade also impacts on the import of medical supplies, including chemotherapy. So when I went in 2016, I was meeting patients who either hadn't been able to start their chemo for months, or they'd maybe had 2 or 3 doses, and then there was a sudden gap until they got the next. And the way chemotherapy works against cancer cells, it's vital that the doses are given at a regular point based on what the drug is. And therefore this was actually diminishing the functionality of the chemotherapy. And as you see on the slide, a study, an American study done in 2011, showed that the survival, the 5-year survival from breast cancer in Gaza at that time was only 43%. That's not just less than half of what it would be here in Scotland or the UK. That's less than half of what it would be 10 miles up the road in Ashkelon in Israel. And this is not women who are thousands of miles away across a desert in a remote part of the world. This is people who are just next door to one of the very advanced health systems in the world. And what you're looking at here, this is the resuscitation room of Al-Shifa, which is the biggest hospital, or was the biggest hospital. It's now a ruin in Gaza. And as you see, most of those boxes that in our A&E would all be stacked up with vials of drugs ready for use are empty or almost empty. And again, WHO estimates that 40% of essential drugs run at what's called zero stock. That means you've got less than a month's supply. So coming back from that, I worked with MAP to set up a Scotland-Gaza breast cancer partnership. And that was supported and funded by medical aid for Palestinians, but also working with the Ministry of Health. Now, I had been lead of the West of Scotland Breast Cancer Network, and through that I was able to arrange for emails to go out through all 3 breast cancer networks in Scotland to surgeons, oncologists, breast care nurses, pathologists, radiologists, to see who would like to get involved in such a project. And I was really touched at how many people came forward and volunteered. In Gaza itself, Dr. Abdul Latif, who'd been a junior doctor with me back in 1991, was now the director of hospitals. And so he was able, instead of every Tom, Dick and Harry doing whatever they wanted to breast cancer patients, he created a specialist team of surgeons, radiologists, pathologists and oncologists who worked across 2 hospitals in Al-Shifa and Nasser for us to engage with, to share our knowledge, to provide training and education. And both the ministry and MAP invested in new equipment like mammogram, ultrasound, but also MAP particularly provided reagents, biopsy needles to allow us to change the approach. When I went in 2016, the approach to diagnosing patients was incredibly basic, whereas we do a lot of study on the cancer to work out what its weaknesses are, and therefore to work out what the best treatment is. And so a lot of our focus was on that early pathway through diagnosis, the radiology and the pathology, and right up to the treatment planning. I then was introducing, and followed by other surgeons who went out, more modern surgical techniques to allow women to keep their breasts and also to have less destructive surgery under their arm if possible. For advanced cancers, we still often have to do, even here, a mastectomy and auxiliary clearance. But knowing that someone needed it, rather than it was just done for no good reason, is quite a big difference. And one of the most successful things that worked with Gaza, but has still always been more of a struggle in the West Bank, is that we set up an online multidisciplinary treatment meeting 7 o'clock every Tuesday morning. So you can imagine how early myself and colleagues had to get up. And we would do that from 7 till 8 o'clock, and then my colleagues would go on to work, and obviously I would go on to Parliament. I hadn't done that for quite a while because I've gradually been getting too far away from the clinical coalface. But that was running right up until the 7th of October. Indeed, there was due to be one of these team-to-team training visits going to Gaza on the 6th of November, which of course had to be abandoned. And the ones that we normally did every year to the West Bank are also not happening at the moment, because as I say, there's a lot of violence and tension in the West Bank as well. And I developed the Scottish Quality Improvement Standards back in 2000, and in 2019 I created a simplified version which we introduced both to Gaza and the West Bank. But particularly in Gaza, MAP supported the development of a database so that they were carrying out audit, collecting their data, and so that we could actually use that to keep driving quality forward, exactly as we've done in Scotland. This is me leading the first breast cancer team in September 2017. This is Andy from Tayside, a radiologist, with the radiographer and local radiologist in the beautiful new mammogram unit in Al-Shifa, which of course you've now seen the pictures of Al-Shifa. While I was introducing lumpectomy, which is breast conservation, removing the cancer, but keeping the breast if possible, and using the much more minimal technique that we use to assess the lymph nodes so as to minimize the risk of things like lymphedema. And as I said, I introduced the breast cancer standards, but I chaired online the Gaza Cancer Conference in 2021, their breast cancer session, and it was fantastic to hear their first run of audit data showing that more than half of patients were now managing to keep their breasts. Turning that around literally in less than 4 years, that is an incredible achievement by any medical team. And I was just so proud of my Gaza colleagues for everything that they achieved. But it's important that we don't forget that the issue is political. As I say, this is not remoteness or lack of materials or anything else. What we have been seeing in Gaza since 2006 is a relentless destruction of infrastructure every few years, particularly in 2008-9 in the winter, and then the invasion of 2014. But of course, the numbers who were killed in both of those attacks pale into insignificance with what we're looking at in retribution for Hamas's attack of the 7th of October. And what we've seen is de-development. After the 2008-9 attacks on Gaza, the international community, NGOs and governments came forward with funding to rebuild. When I visited in 2016, what you saw was that a lot of the destruction of 2014 hadn't been rebuilt. Now, some of that is the blockade means that Israel will not allow building materials in because they describe them as dual use. So it's actually quite difficult to repair buildings. But it was also that many international players were just simply saying, what's the point? What's the point in us giving you £500,000 or dollars or euros if it's just going to get destroyed in another few years? And that's what you have, is you have this relentless de-development because of ongoing destruction. And of course, all of it pales into insignificance with the destruction we're looking at now. We're not talking surgical strikes. We're not talking taking out very precise people or very precise pieces of infrastructure. We're talking about whole city blocks. And the same in 2014. You know, over 100,000 people were made homeless in 2014. And when I visited 2 years later, 30,000 of them were still homeless. So Gaza was in crisis before the 7th of October. Indeed, the UN had been describing it as becoming progressively unlivable due to a combination of the blockade and the destruction of 2014. For example, the power plant was bombed in 2014 and never allowed to be reconstructed. So Gaza was completely dependent on Israel for electricity. And people in Gaza, including hospitals, would only be allowed 4 hours of electricity a day on a rota basis. So hospitals were having to invest in diesel generators, diesel, eventually solar panels if they could get them. Ordinary people, if your place on the rota was 1 a.m. to 5 a.m, tough. You had to get up, cook your dinner, charge your car batteries and prepare for the rest of the day. And similarly, with drinking water and sanitation. So when we lived there, now obviously you went through a bit of a ropey change, getting used to the water, as anybody who's ever lived in a different part of the world, so a few tummy upsets between the two of us. But once you got through that acclimatization, the water in Gaza in the early 90s was drinkable. But with water being taken out of the aquifers relentlessly, the ingress of saline from the sea, the destruction of the aquifers, the water in Gaza is now more than 90% undrinkable. And people were dependent on the desalination plants. And of course, right now, they're not working. Some of them are bombed, some of the pipes from them are bombed, and most of them can't function because they've got no fuel or power. And what we also saw was the population, as I say, has doubled from about 1 million 30 years ago to over 2 million now. And yet again, they were neither allowed the permission or the construction materials to build new sewage plants or expand the old one. So raw sewage is simply discharged into the sea at several points along the coast. That white river that runs across the beach is just raw sewage. And you'll notice that instead of the Med having a nice pale turquoise look about it, where the water is shallow, it's dark. The stench was overpowering. And this highlights almost the craziness of this, because the current takes this soiled, contaminated water up the coast towards Tel Aviv and towards Israel's desalination plants, which sometimes can't function because of the sewage contamination. And important to remember that the blockade also applies at sea. The blockade was 6 miles out for most of the length of the Gaza Strip, but the reef, where the best fishing grounds are, was 9 miles out. So Gaza Harbour, which you see here, was full of these rusting hulks because there was simply no sustainable option for deep sea fishing. And instead it had switched to these tiny little skiffs for inshore fishing. And this was one of the main industries that Gaza had, was fantastic fish and seafood. Of course, where does Gaza look now? You've all seen the pictures. The satellite image on the left, the red, shows the damaged infrastructure. And apart from still some remnants of grey down at Rafah when this was taken, obviously it would directly match on to a map of Gaza. Of course, now with the Rafah invasion, it will be almost complete. And it's reported that over 80% of housing infrastructure has been damaged or completely destroyed. And Gaza City has turned from that top picture, which is one of my pictures from 2019, to the image at the bottom. All of us have seen multiple images of the sheer scale of destruction. And that includes houses, it includes UN schools, historic mosques and churches, the main traditional historic libraries of Gaza, and particularly universities. All 12 universities have been bombed, including the 2 medical schools. So we have almost 2,000 medical students who no longer have a medical school. And of course, the slaughter. I have to update this slide with every single talk that I do because the numbers keep rising. Over 30,000 people dead, including 2/3 women and children. Over 80,000 injured, including thousands of children who have amputations of at least one limb and will need prosthetics every year or so as they grow. It's reported that 350,000 to 400,000 people are suffering from infectious diseases or lack of control of their chronic illnesses because they can't access medicines. And when I attended a briefing from a surgeon who had recently returned from Gaza, he said every single wound is infected because we have no antibiotics. We are limited in medical dressings. We often don't even have access to sterile water to clean wounds. And people are not healing or recovering because of the degree of starvation and malnutrition. We also have lost over 500 healthcare workers, paramedics, nurses, doctors, both killed in hospitals, killed while rescuing people. 500. That is incredible. We couldn't afford to lose that out of our NHS, let alone out of Gaza's. And I'm sorry, bringing down from a blockade that has run for 17 years to a complete siege on water, electricity, food, medicines. Anyone who denies that that is collective punishment is deluding themselves. And yet that's what we have been witnessing when I've been at Westminster or engaged with Westminster or been watching Westminster over the last 8 months. And as I said earlier, the international leaders and governments who are trying to defend this as simply being self-defense are undermining international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and the rules of war. And that means they will have lost all moral authority for any future conflict, because what they have defended now, they will not be able to criticize in the future. And I just have to say personally, they are not numbers. This is a montage that was shared with me this week because it was the birthday of Dima, the daughter of Dr. Abdul Latif, who I mentioned earlier. He lost 48 members of his family on the 21st of November last year when his home was bombed. They were all sheltering in his house because his house was far away from any critical infrastructure in a suburban part of Middle Gaza. 48 people, including Dima, who is close with her husband to the bottom left. Some of you may have seen her picture and her name on the banners at the healthcare vigils in Glasgow, because she was an Erasmus student at Glasgow University, and she worked for the World Health Organization in Gaza as part of the limb reconstruction team. This is our problem. That people in Gaza are being described as numbers, they are being dehumanized, they are being described by prominent Israeli politicians as animals. They're not. They were people, they were beautiful. And the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza is almost complete. Losing so many staff, but over 90% of the hospitals and clinics in Gaza are either severely damaged or completely destroyed. including Al-Shifa and Nasser. MAP are trying to get Nasser functional again, but even where it is, it's difficult for patients to access because of the fighting that's going on in Rafah and Khan Yunis. And we heard after that hit on Ahli hospital, initially on social media, an Israeli digital officer claimed the hit as a success, that they had clearly hit a Hamas weapons store in the Baptist hospital, Al-Ahli. Very quickly that post was taken down, and then it was all blamed on a rogue Hamas missile. And we would never attack a hospital. But this picture on the right is a picture of the hole in the ground that was all that remained of El Wafa Hospital in 2014. When I met the director, he described that they got a phone call giving them 48 hours notice to evacuate because the IDF were going to come into Gaza in 2014 through their hospital. And he said, we can't evacuate. This is a rehabilitation hospital for people with spinal and head injuries. We can't move them. He got a phone call the next day saying, you've now got 24 hours to evacuate your hospital because we're coming in. And that is what was left. And David Knott, the world-renowned war surgeon who has been to Gaza in the last few months, says he has never seen, not in Syria, not in any other conflict zone he's been in, destruction of healthcare infrastructure like he has seen in Gaza. So what does Gaza need now? Well, first of all, it needs peace. It needs a ceasefire. But then it needs everything. It will need something of the scale of the Marshall Plan that was used after the Second World War to rebuild Central Europe. International organizations will need to provide water, sanitation, shelter, and food. But the health NGOs like MAP, MSF, and others will need to provide healthcare on a scale that we have hardly seen anywhere. This isn't a natural disaster. This is just relentless destruction, and it isn't even over yet. Most NGOs will naturally focus on trauma, and it's important within that they consider these child amputees. I'm actually visiting the National Centre here in Scotland next Thursday to meet the prosthetics team to see if we could get a partnership going between them and Gaza as we help these children recover. But it's hard to imagine there'll be anybody left alive in Gaza who isn't suffering from post-traumatic stress, from what they've seen, from what they've heard, from what they've lived through. And that includes the doctors and nurses, the horrific decisions they've had to make in who to treat and who to abandon. In doing an amputation when there would have been other options in normal times. They will be traumatized right down to their very souls. As I mentioned, we will need a massive response on infectious diseases, including the provision of antibiotics, but also vaccines. None of the almost 200 babies born a day in Gaza will have been vaccinated, and therefore we could easily see outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases. And what's always in danger of getting overlooked is what's called non-communicable diseases. This is the bread and butter that our NHS deals with every day: diabetes, heart disease, cancer. And many of us who have been engaged with the occupied territories over recent years, that was our specialty, was Gaza and palliative care, because it often gets overlooked by the agencies and the NGOs who are working there. So what we did was we have set up the Scottish-Palestinian Health Partnership, and we launched it at the end of April. Its web address is in the top left for anybody medical, or if you know anybody medical who might be interested. And obviously I've talked a lot about medical aid for Palestinians. Their website address is at the top right. We are not an NGO. We are a network of clinicians and academics who want to support justice, sovereignty, and healthcare in the occupied territories. We will work with NGOs like MAP and MSF to reach out into our NHS, recruit people with skills or knowledge that they can contribute. Some of that might be from Scotland, such as our online treatment meeting. It might be people taking part in a case discussion on a difficult case. It might be teaching the medical students through a project which is being run by PalMed Academy, which is trying to get their syllabus up and running online. And eventually, it may be in people returning to the occupied territories. And we make sure that these projects that are looking for volunteers are advertised on the Global Citizenship Programme of the NHS that encourages people to share their knowledge and expertise with people across the world. And if someone is volunteering to actually work in the occupied territories, because of our experience, we'll be able to give them support in how to get leave, how to get funding, how to connect with the charities, but also brief them in what to expect, as far as we're able to do. Because even though many of us have worked in Gaza off and on for many years, what Gaza looks like now is not the Gaza of pre-October the 7th. And it's a fairly small membership, but people who sign up, we will be producing newsletters, we will be organising conferences, including we're aiming to organise one in Glasgow in the autumn. And I was asked when preparing this talk to be thinking about what could Scotland do if we were independent. Now, our First Minister at the time, Humza Yousaf, already has attracted a lot of recognition for the fact that he got it right from the start. And he took a lot of flack for speaking up against Hamas, for the people who were injured, bereaved, or taken hostage on the 7th of October, while also condemning the violence and the slaughter in Gaza. You saw him visit the memorial of that young IDF soldier from Glasgow who was killed right at the start. The image of him taking that chap's mother in his arms, the work he has done to bring both the Muslim and the Jewish community together in Scotland and not allowing this crisis to divide us in Scotland, to cause us to blame either community, when they frankly haven't contributed to this at all. And the difference would have been if he was the First Minister of an independent Scotland, in the UN, in the EU, calling for an acceptance of all the ICJ, International Court of Justice, provisional measures, calling for an immediate ceasefire, opening the crossings for humanitarian aid and the release of the hostages. His voice would have been amplified. We would have had a vote in the UN. We would have had influence in the EU if we were there, instead of our voice being buried under the voice of the UK government, which frankly has simply not called out the slaughter and has used what I describe, both the UK government and the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, using what I call a word salad, trying to avoid saying what needs to be said. But we could also have taken concrete action. Number one, we could recognise Palestine. We probably would have recognised Palestine already in the past. But if not, we could have been acting with Ireland, Spain, Belgium, Norway to recognise it now. Because how can you talk about a two-state solution without two states? We could have been offering visas to allow the relatives of Palestinians and Gazans here to come to Scotland. We could offer visas to other refugees, but as a very minimum to allow family reunification. We could also have been accepting patients who needed complex care to be evacuated to our NHS, whereas the UK is not offering any visas or any opportunity for patients to come to the UK. We could have an embargo on any ammunition or weapons from Scottish firms going to Israel. Now, I know that arms firms are quite a popular target for protesters, but it's important to remember that arms manufacturers are also manufacturing weapons and ammunition that's going to Ukraine, where people think that the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves against the Russian invasion. The licensing of arms to go to any part of the world is the responsibility of government. If it was the responsibility of an independent Scottish government, we would be able to have an arms embargo on Israel in the current circumstances. It even says in UK law that arms should not be licensed for sale to anywhere where they will be used to subjugate the population, to subjugate any part of the population, or to break international law. And yet, none of these licenses have been revoked. And that would be a power that we would have. So that not just here, but in other conflicts in the world, a Scottish government could say, that is not an appropriate place for any Scottish manufactured ammunition or weapons to be deployed. We could ban settlement goods. Now obviously Michael Gove was planning legislation to make it that nobody, not a town council or city council, not a pension fund, not a company, could disengage from investing in West Bank settlements or buying goods from them, because he called it the boycott bill. This isn't boycotting. Settlements are illegal. Making profit from the occupation of land or settling occupied land is illegal. So these goods are illegal. This isn't boycotting. Boycotting is when you refuse to buy or import goods that actually are technically legal because you're trying to make a point. That's not the case. This is due diligence. This is making sure that your university or pension fund or your city is not engaged in illegal practice by investing in or importing from or procuring illegal goods from settlements. And in particular, an independent Scotland could contribute to a genuine peace process, because that's where we have to get to. My hope from this current horror is that the international community finally recognises ignoring this is not a solution. Waiting for things to calm down a bit and then moving attention elsewhere is not a solution. We are in a relentless cycle of repression, revenge, retribution. And that frankly just leads to the abyss. When we lived there, we were there at the start of the Madrid Peace Conference. That led to the Oslo Accords. Norway, a small country similar to Scotland, played a critical role in those peace talks. An independent Scotland could do exactly the same. We also, a Scottish Defence Force, could contribute to peacekeeping, because it was very notable that when we lived there, the UN observer soldiers, there were no British or American soldiers, because there was too much baggage. They were from much more neutral countries, like Finland, Norway, Iceland, Holland, Canada. We could play our role, not just there, but also in other parts of the world. Because this is vital. When things get a bit quieter, and Gaza turns from a current crisis into a chronic degradation of people, the worry is it'll just move off the news agenda, which we are already seeing. And the international community will do what it did after every one of those previous invasions. It will just switch its attention to somewhere else and abandon the Palestinians all over again. So what can we do as individuals? I know that sometimes it feels overwhelming, but like atoms in any structure, every single one of us working together becomes more powerful. We amplify each other. We can make change happen. That can be through fundraising to help charities like MAP, like MSF. It's through, if you have a position of influence, using your advocacy to stand up for Palestinian rights and for human rights, and never stop campaigning for us to reach a point of having a peaceful outcome. And of course, as Christians for independence, we mustn't forget prayer. I used to be a SCIAF ambassador, and I remember going on a visit to Kenya and Tanzania to visit AIDS projects, and we were told, you need to come back with positive stories. We don't want those pictures of children in Biafra with flies crawling in their eyes. We want to talk about what Africans are doing for themselves. I thought, how on earth do I find a positive story? I could have come back in 24 hours. I met such powerful people. And the sense of prayer and thankfulness that they had put all of us who worked for SCIAF at absolutely to shame. And I have to say that every night when I'm going to bed, I can't help but think of my friends, my colleagues, the people I worked with from Gaza, the doctors and nurses that I know so well who are trapped in Gaza or have been displaced from Gaza to Egypt or further afield. I'm lying in a warm, comfortable bed. Where are they? So trying to just give a moment of thought and prayer for people, because we need to pray for a just peace, but we also need to work for a just peace. Because it's only by achieving a just peace that recognises Palestinian sovereignty and rights and self-determination that we can create a situation that brings peace and security, not just to the Palestinians, but to the Israeli population as well. So that's what I call on everybody to do. Whether you're a member of a Christian faith or not, all of us in some way can work towards that just peace. Thank you.
So I'm sure you'll agree that was a very interesting but also very moving presentation. One of the points that struck me most, she said, these are not numbers, these are real people, and a lot of them are my friends, people I knew.
The organisation, the charity that she works with is called Medical Aid for Palestinians. If you've got any spare cash and you can send some their way, please do that. We'll put the link up.
And thanks very much for watching. And thanks to Christians for Independence for sharing it with us and letting us broadcast it. The link, if you would like to donate to the MAP organisation, it's www.map.org.uk. We'll be back again next Friday with another podcast, and look out for the video version of this one, which will be premiering on our YouTube channel, IndiePod Extra, on Tuesday at 8 o'clock.